Of the 5 essential elements of trading card game design, 3 are likely to come up before a new player plays their first game. After the questions, how do I win, and how do I play cards, the last obvious question a new player is probably going to ask is, how do our cards interact? Or if you're a normal person, you might just ask, hey, what are those numbers on the bottom of the card? What do they do? Which brings us to the third essential element of trading card game design, rules-based interaction. Rules-based interaction is fairly simple to define. It's interaction between the cards held by different players based on rules. To clarify this a bit, interaction is anything that will affect the other player, either their cards or their life. And by being rules-based, it excludes any interaction with the opponent that is based on card effects, or text written on the card. It's fairly easy to see in other games, since most traditional card games don't actually have any text on the cards. It's all done through the rules. For example, in Crazy 8, the card you play will then determine which card the opponent is able to play on their next turn. Meanwhile, in poker, players compare the power of their hands, but if you combine 2 cards of the same rank, you get a power boost to your hand, which gives you an advantage over the opponent. Nothing is actually written on the cards that say they have this function. This is all coded within the rules, and are a part of how the players use the cards within the game to interact. In trading card games, this rule-based interaction is also present, but it looks a little bit different. It looks something like this. There are card games out there that function just fine without direct rules-based interaction, like the deck-building game Dominion. So why is this an essential element within trading card games? The first big advantage this rules-based interaction system will bring in is that it is built on numbers, and just having numbers printed on cards is kind of exciting. Even if someone has no idea what a mana pool is, or a graveyard or a library, they can still see a big number and figure out that that shiny dragon is something powerful. Even the most experienced players will find it hard to argue that sometimes big number just feel good. Realistically, looking at a card's resource cost will probably give you a better idea of power, but it's hard for players to get excited looking at a price tag. More importantly though, is that these rules provide a guaranteed window for interaction. Without interaction, games will essentially turn into just 2 players playing solitaire racing to see who finishes first. This is even worse in trading card games because they have a huge card pool and a variety of strategies, which makes it very difficult to guess what kind of effect interaction is going to be effective against an unknown deck. Creatures and attack phases offer a standard of interaction, and because it's standard across the game, the tools of interaction, which in this case are creature cards in most games, can have a higher potential damage output than non-creature sources that are more difficult to interact with, because countering a creature is as simple as playing another creature, while countering a non-creature is much more difficult, usually requiring a specific card effect. What this means is that a deck without creatures will be facing a stiff penalty, since they will have to compete with the superior damage output of opposing creatures by using non-creature damage sources that are, by design, weaker. In practice, what this does is it focuses interaction on this single standard card type, which means not only are players able to interact using these types of cards, but it also makes it much safer to include effect interaction that will target that specific card type. You don't need to guess exactly what kind of card type your opponent is going to have in their deck. Further, rules-based interaction goes a long way to determining the pacing and overall feel of the game. In Magic the Gathering, the defensive player is able to set up their blocks in the way most advantageous to them, and they're also able to double block. While the attacker is faced with the worst possible set of blocks the defender can set up for them, and there's also no rules to help the attacker combine their attackers as a unit. Making things even worse, cards can attack or block, but not both, which means that when a player decides to attack, they are penalizing themselves by removing a creature from their blocking lineup. All this combines to make a system that heavily favors the defending player, which helps reinforce the importance of effect-based interactions within Magic's gameplay, such as using evasion or removal to bypass opposing defenses. Meanwhile, in a later game, created by the same designer, Keyforge, rules interactions favor the active player much more. They are able to decide when and where they want to attack, and they're even able to choose whether their creatures will advance their score, bringing them closer to victory, or attack the opponent's board to disrupt their ability to increase their score. Magic games tend to end in a big bang once one player gains a clear and persistent advantage over the opponent. Meanwhile, Keyforge games end in a race as both players rapidly close in on their final objective. While plenty of games have similar life systems or resource engines, no two TCGs have quite the same combat system, and that's because so much of a game's identity is built into their rules-based interaction. Resource engines and life totals want to be as unintrusive as possible. You kind of want them to do their job, but largely stay out of sight and out of mind. Most of the player's attention during gameplay will be spent on using their cards to interact with the opponent's cards, and trying to manage how their opponent's cards are able to interact back. Because there's so much attention on this aspect of gameplay, a robust rules-based interaction system is essential to trading card game design.